Okay, so tonight we are in the fifth section of our series where we've been talking about Christ-centered parenting, gospel conversations on complex issues. We've covered four sections already. This section, section number 5, is all about relationships. And the last session we did was about marriage. Tonight we're talking about broken relationships. And this is one of the topics that I am most passionate about. And I'll tell you why. Because as a coach, a lot of times people come to me with various forms of broken relationships, right? And they want some sort of restoration. It can be, I've had people come and say, help me get a divorce and do it well. I've had people come to say, I don't want to split from my husband, but I don't know how to stay in this relationship and it not drive me crazy. And more than just marriages, I've talked to lots of people that are wanting to work on the restoration of relationships with their kids or with their adult children, or how to rekindle a relationship with somebody who's hurt them, or a friend, extended family. So broken relationships can cover such a wide variety of situations, not just broken marriages, that I kind of wanted to expand this idea of broken relationships out from what the book uses and talk about, number one, how can we model good examples of relationships and good qualities of relationships to support building strength and foundation into those, so that our kids learn how to do that sort of naturally. Like, that's just how they grow up. They know how to do that. But then also using these tools as a way to discuss and engage with our kids to not only navigate the relationships that they encounter that feel broken, but also how to respond when they encounter brokenness in relationships. Maybe they're trying to figure out how to interact with parents that are divorced. Maybe you're divorced, or maybe there's infidelity, or maybe it can be all kinds, right, of different reasons why a relationship ends up broken. Maybe there's a separation and it's a healthy separation. Like, I've had clients who have like their spouse, they've been an alcoholic, and so they separate for a time so that spouse can get the help that they need. And so all kinds of different ways. And tonight we really want to talk about how can we steward this conversation around broken relationships well. So I want to start with there's a verse from Hebrews 13:4 that is recommended from the text that we're using, that Christ-centered parenting text. And it says, this is speaking directly to marriage. It says, let marriage be held in honor among all, and let the marriage bed be undefiled, for God will judge the sexually immoral and adulterous. It's interesting. There's lots of different encouragement around brotherly love in this particular passage. That's just one of the things. It's talking about showing hospitality to strangers. In verse 2, it talks about remembering the people that are in prison. In verse 3, people who are mistreated, honoring your marriage, keeping your life free from the love of money, be content, believe that God will never leave you and forsake you, remembering your leaders. So it's this verse about marriage is in the context of an overarching principle of value the relationships, respect the fact that we're all made in the image of God. We're to treat each other respectfully, treat each other honorably. And when we enter into a commitment with another person, it's important to take that very seriously and to respect them as if we are making a commitment to God. That's really what we are what that relationship is to look like. Like if I said I was going to do something, I committed to God to do something, then hopefully I would be pretty serious about that. Like, yeah, I'm going to do it. And equally, if God made a commitment to me, if he said, I'll never leave you or forsake you, and he made that commitment to me, we would expect him to keep it, right? We would say, yeah, I think I expect him to do what he said he would do. And so there's this trust that when we're putting our trust in that belief that what God says he's going to do, that he will do. He's not a liar. We can trust him. We can believe him. And we want to communicate that to him. And so our relationships with each other are a model of that relationship that God has with us. We want to model that behavior to others. And that's a great launching point for having good conversations with your kids around this topic. Often the conversations in our own family will be like, what does it look like to have a conversation? Like a conversation with our kids would be like, what does it look like to have a relationship where I'm committed to it, even if you aren't? What kind of things, who would I be? How would I show up? What would I do? And so that's what we really want to talk about. I heard from a friend of mine, or an acquaintance who's passed away now, but they use this definition for love that says, love is to will the good of another. Like if we're truly loving other people, then we want what's in their best interest. Sometimes what's in their best interest is the same thing that they want from us. And other times, what's in their best interest is not the same thing that they want from us, right? It's easy to see with kids, right? If love is to will the good of another, and my son comes in and says, hey, I'd love to eat gummy bears for dinner tonight, I might think about, well, what would be the loving thing to do in that situation? Would it be loving to give him gummy bears for dinner? Well, probably not. We probably need to have a conversation around that, right? Because that I wouldn't normally think that gummy bears for dinner would be in his best interest. So to love him in that moment would be encouraging him to do something different. Now, it looks different, right, when it's a spouse, because we aren't in charge of them in the same way. We aren't telling them what they can and can't do like we can a toddler. But some of those same questions still apply. If we say to love is to will the good of another, I want what's in your best interest, I am for you, then that can look like, part of that is the freedom to choose. To love them is part of it. What's in their best interest is to have the freedom to choose, so that they are responsible for the choices that they make. Jesus offers that to everyone, and we'll see that in just a minute in one of the scriptures. And then the other part is that, how do I show up based on what would be in their best interest? Who do I choose to be? How do I choose to interact in this relationship so that I'm in integrity with what God's called me to do and how he's called me to interact with you? So those are some interesting conversation topics that you can have with your older kids. Like, what does it mean to, if you love someone, to will the good of another, to operate with their best interest in mind? One thing that we talk about let me read that verse. I want to go back and read that verse from Deuteronomy first, about where it talks about we have this freedom of choice, because this is a really powerful part of our freedom that we have, and God has modeled this for us. And so I want to show you this. I'm going to tell you a really interesting story about the freedom to choose. So in Deuteronomy chapter 30, You have to remember, God's given the law to the Israelites. He's through Moses. He's told them all the things that they're supposed to do and not do. He actually lays out, if you obey, you will be blessed. And he gives great detail about what that blessing looks like, to be in obedience and then it receive all kinds of blessing. That's in Deuteronomy 28. He goes on to talk about, and if you disobey, there's going to be consequences for that. And he makes that very clear. And then he gives a vision of what's going to happen in the future. And then at the end, God says this in so this is Deuteronomy 30, verses 19 and 20. It says, I call heaven and earth to witness against you today, that I have set before you life and death. Like, hey, I've shown you these two choices, right? Blessing and curse. Therefore, choose life, that you and your offspring may live, loving the Lord your God, obeying his voice, and holding fast to him, for he is your life and the length of your days, that you may dwell in the land that the Lord swore to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, to give them. So he says, hey, here's the two options, right? He's like, option A is choose life and blessing. Option B, choose death, the curse, the consequences of not following what I've given you to do. He says, choose life. So we have that example of, we have a choice that we get to make. We have always been free to choose. God didn't produce robots that were forced to serve him. It's interesting, in our human minds, it's hard to hold the same thought of God knows who's going to choose him. And therefore, there's this conversation around predestination, right? This idea that he already knows who's going to choose him. And so he operates with that knowing in how he plays things out. And yet he also, in his greatness, in a way that we can't perceive because we're human, he also gives each one of us full freedom to choose him or not choose him. So it's not like he's choosing for us. He just knows which choice we would make no matter what. And we get to make that choice, right? But often what happens in relationship, and it's so important, first of all, it's so important to know that that's the basis behind what I'm about to say, because it can feel scary to let other people choose in the midst of relationship conflict, or choose things that we might not like. And so, but there is freedom to choose. And that's what I want you to recognize, that this is a great conversation to talk about with your kids as they get older, is that they have this freedom to choose. My dad, when I was growing up as a teenager, and we would get in conflict, he would say things like, Mary, the only fence that's really out there as far as a boundary of where you're allowed to go or what you're allowed to do, truly the only fence that exists is the one that you create yourself. The fence doesn't actually exist. It's just the perimeter that you decide. This is where I will go and no further. Even with parents, like we say, oh, I'm going to make my kid da 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 da. Well, if you have any teenagers at all, that quickly comes to the place where you're like, yeah, I can't actually make them obey. At some point they have to choose. And so beginning to have these conversations around, what does the choice look like? That's the model, right? The choice that God gave us to choose blessing or choose the curses in Deuteronomy is a great model for discussions with our kids. What happens when you choose this path? Okay, now what happens when you choose this other path over here? And getting them to see the blessing or the consequences of the choices that they make. So that's one of the main things that can be really helpful as we're navigating broken relationships. A lot of times when relationships aren't working the way we want them to, The tendency is to like clamp down and want to force the person into doing the things the way that we want. It's natural that we want to control it so that there's less variability and we don't get surprised, or we can avoid pain. So that's sometimes the reason that we do that. But anytime we're trying to force something, like we're pushing, most of the time the other person is going to resist that just naturally. If you push against something, the tendency is for them to push back. And so it doesn't open a way for freedom. And I want to tell you about this story in our own marriage so that you can see kind of how this plays out. Once upon a time, as I was getting my business going, I had this opportunity to go on a business retreat to Hawaii. And man, did I want to go. It was a week-long trip, but it was going to be thousands of dollars that we did not have at the time. It was not something that was anywhere close to in our budget. The likelihood of us being able to pay it off in the next like 4 or 5 years would have been like practically speaking, looking at the numbers, it would have been years before we could have paid off the expense, just where we were financially at the time. But I wanted to go. And I went to Brandon and I said, I really want to go on this trip. Now, I will tell you, just based on coaching lots of people through relationships, most people at that moment, if your spouse came to you and said, can I have permission to pay thousands of dollars? I'm going to put it on the credit card and go on this trip without us knowing how to pay for that, or even pay the minimum amount on the credit card. Most spouses would turn around and say, no, no, you can't do that. That's just no. And then what would happen? If he had said no, I would be mad. I would be mad that he's like, he just doesn't understand. Now it's his fault that I don't get to go. And it absolves me of the responsibility of having to pay attention to that need. But instead, Brandon said something very brave in that moment when I said, this is the trip I want to go on, and this is the money I want to spend, and I want to spend it. I want to put it on the credit card. He did not say yes. He did not say no. He said, you have always been free to do what you want to do. Now, there's a lot of risk in that, isn't there? There's a lot of risk in this idea of giving the other person freedom, even at the expense of the possibility that it might cost you something. And so that was a risk. Well, I left kind of frustrated from that conversation. Like, he didn't really give me an answer, but he'd given me the freedom to do what I wanted to do. And so I went back and I thought about it, and it was the best answer he could have given me, because if he had said yes, and then we didn't have the money on the other side, like I would have gotten to go, like, he said, yes, I can put it on there when I'm going to go. Then when I get back and we can't pay, now he's carrying the blame and the responsibility of making that decision with me. It's not all just on me. Like, oh no, we made this decision together. You said it was okay. Now I can offload some of the blame of the uncomfortableness of having spent that money. If he had said no, now it gets to be his fault that I didn't get to go, right? And I'll just tell you, women, we do this to our husbands a lot. Like, it is so common to not ask for permission because we're wanting to honor them, but actually asking for permission or for them to say yes or no because we don't want to carry the responsibility. And it's something I had to learn. And I did learn it in this moment, because when he put the responsibility back on me and he said, you have always been free to do what you want to do or what you think is right. And I had to wrestle with that myself. In the end, I couldn't make that decision. I couldn't decide to take that risk with the money and put it on the credit card. In the end, the the short story of how that turned out is that I did actually end up being able to go. God provided the money through a couple of different ways that I learned some other lessons, which are stories for another day. But I want you to see that sometimes the scariest thing when we're in conflict with somebody, sometimes the scariest thing can be or feel like it's giving them the freedom to make the choice themselves. And yet, often it is one of the most vital principles in standing in having a relationship that works well together. Giving the other person the freedom to choose empowers them to take 100% responsibility for the decisions that they make. And I'm telling you, it can cut out a lot of the conflict. So I spent a lot of time on that because it's super valuable, and it comes up over and over and over again with the clients that I coach and in different conflict and situations where people struggle. So that's one of the principles. We've always been free to do what we want. And if we can empower the other people in our lives to know that that's the case, even with our teens in healthy ways, which I can talk to you more about that one-on-one if you're interested, but if we can empower them, it will settle down a lot of the relationship stuff because people start taking responsibility for their own choices and their own consequences. And that builds a stronger relationship. It does. So the second principle that is helpful to remember that you can discuss with your family, with your kids, is it only takes one person to change the dance. I love thinking about this from the standpoint of if two people are have learned a dance step, right? Say they're learning the waltz, right? And so the girl has the steps that she does and the guy has the steps that he does, and they work together well, right? Say one person thinks that they need to be dancing something different. It only takes one person to change the dance. You immediately start altering the dance steps. Now, it does get messy at first because the other person's like, wait, no, we're dancing the waltz. You're stepping the wrong way. But if the other person can say, no, actually, I'm ready to dance a new dance step with you, and I'm willing to let this be messy until we can figure it out, it only has to take one, and the dance has changed. And you don't have to stay in a dance that you don't want, that you feel like is not serving you in the relationship, right? Now, I'm not talking about bailing on the relationship. I'm talking about enabling behaviors that create conflict, that create brokenness, that create distance from each other, that are I call it co-conspirators in mediocrity, where one person yells and so the other person yells, and then one person blames and so the other person blames, and so then this person walks away and doesn't talk for days, and so this person decides not to walk away and doesn't talk for days, and you can end up with this distance that's created. That's a dance that we do. We all have these dances of relationships, these patterns. You get into, like, if you get into a little argument or something with somebody you love, you tend to go around the same pattern of how that happens, right? And so what if it just took one person to change that pattern? You don't have to wait for the other person to change the pattern. You can change the pattern. And talking about what that looks like with our kids is so powerful. What does it look like to change the dance? What does it look like, rather than saying, I always have to say sorry first, why can't they say I'm sorry? It looks like, no, I have the power to change the dance by apologizing and asking for forgiveness first. Even if I feel like they did more things wrong than I did. What if I can change this dance, why not? Why not change it? And then the third principle that I wanted to bring out is we get more of what we focus on. So I was kind of trying to pull out 3 different things that come up in relationship coaching that I do on a regular basis. And these were the 3. We've always been free to do what we want. How can you empower the other person to recognize that for themselves? It only takes one person to change the dance, and recognizing that you have the power to change the relationship right where you are You do not have to wait for the other person. And then this third one is we get more of what we focus on. And this is a great conversation for kids with the relationships that they're in and focusing on the things about like where they don't get along with their siblings or they don't get along with this or that child. If you're wondering about good passages of scripture to read for around relationships, I encourage you to check out Galatians, because the whole theme of Galatians is to be free, And so Galatians chapter 5, verse 1 says, for freedom Christ has set us free. Stand firm, therefore, and do not submit again to a yoke of slavery. So this idea that Christ has set us free, right? We talked about we've been free to do what we want. You're free to change the dance. And now you're free to choose what you're focusing on, and you're going to get what you're focusing on. I was just at this pool with my kids today. They're doing their swim practice. And the coach there said, where your head goes, your body goes, right? That's what he spoke. It's like, if your head's in the water going forward, your body's going to follow along. And so it reminded me of this point that we were going to talk about tonight, that we get more with what we focus on. A lot of times when there's brokenness in the relationship, whether it's divorce or whether it's some sort of just not getting along with extended family or things like that, we tend to focus on what's not working. We tend to focus on what the other person that's doing is, they're doing annoying, like it's driving you crazy or it's frustrating. We tend to focus on how they always do that thing, or how we never get our end of the deal, or how we've overgiven and they haven't, it's their turn, It's interesting that just like that swim practice today, where your head goes, your body goes, we get more of what we focused on. So if you're focused on how it's like you're having to give more than what they are, it's all you're going to see. You'll get more of that you have the perspective that you give more than what the other person does. If you're focused on how they never show up, or they never say sorry first, you always say sorry first, you will only focus on the times that you have to say sorry, and you won't ever focus on any kind of repentance that the other person does. Our brains are looking for the information to validate our position. It's kind of like when you just either decide that you're going to get a new car, or you just get, or like you've recently purchased a new car, and all of a sudden that's the car that you see all over the place. It's like newly in your awareness. And it's not that that there's more of those cars suddenly on the road. It's just that that's the perception of what's on the road, right? And so the same way in our relationships, if you're focused on what isn't working and that's all you can see, you're going to be like, wow, I can see all these places where it isn't working. Yeah, because that's the only thing you're looking for. And so when we talk to our kids about this, it is so powerful when they're experiencing conflict with another parent, with another sibling. We can restore those broken relationships by saying, what do you want more of? Do you want to see that person, like how they care about you? Then you're going to need to focus on looking for every moment that they care about you, and not looking at where you feel hurt or ostracized or avoided or stuff like that. Excuse me. So these are the three things that I think you can hone in on talking to your kids about in this context of building people up in relationships to prevent against brokenness, but also to restore after brokenness. So just to go over them again, number one, it's all around freedom, and Galatians is be free. That's the theme of Galatians. I encourage you to go there. So number one, we've always been free to do what we want. how is that true for you and the people around you? And how can you empower the people around you to be able to step into that and choose it in a healthy way? And how do you choose to be free? Like, who do I want to be today so that they have the best chance of success? While they're choosing, I get to choose too, right? Number two, it just takes one person to change the dance. And number three, we get more of what we focus on. I hope these will help you in your conversations with your kids, with your spouse, and with your relationships. And as always, you're welcome to reach out to me. One of my favorite things to coach around is relationships. That's my passion, is helping people love God and love others really well and enjoy the process. So if I can be helpful to you in that way, let me know. Otherwise, I hope these will be a great resource for you and your family. Good to chat with you this evening. Thank you so much for showing up and listening on the replay. I love you all, and I'll see you next week. Bye.